The sterile scent of desiccated dust and old paper usually soothed me. It was the smell of history, of stories waiting to be coaxed from silence. My small office, tucked away in the bowels of the university archives, was my sanctuary. Sunlight, filtered through a grimy window pane, illuminated motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny, forgotten particle of time. I traced a finger over the smooth, cool surface of a femur, its shape so familiar it felt like an extension of my own bone. It was a fragment from a Roman burial site, unremarkable to most, but to me it whispered of diet, of labor, of the very texture of a life lived 2 millennia ago. My world was one of quiet observation, of meticulous cataloging. I preferred the company of the dead. They were predictable, their stories etched in calcium and collagen, unburdened by the messy complexities of the living. Social interaction, with its subtle cues and unspoken expectations, had always been a foreign language I struggled to master. My colleagues, bless their well-meaning hearts, often looked at me with a mixture of pity and exasperation. They saw my solitary existence, my preference for the lab over social gatherings, as a deficiency. I saw it as necessary. To truly understand the stories held within bones, one had to be able to listen, and listening required a profound stillness. A shrill, insistent ringing sliced through the quiet. My phone, an anomaly in my carefully curated stillness. I blinked, the sudden sound jarring my focus. On the screen, an unknown number. Hesitantly, I answered, tucking the receiver between my shoulder and ear as I continued to examine the femur. User NC. The voice was gruff, laced with a gravelly impatience. Speaking, I replied, my voice a little rough from disuse. This is the Regional Archaeological Society. We've got a situation out at the old Blackwood estate dig. Something unusual. My brow furrowed. Blackwood, I knew the site. A relatively minor Saxon settlement, not much expected beyond pottery shards and perhaps a few iron tools. Unusual how? A pause, and then we found a body, buried, not part of the dig, and it's not old, not ancient. My grip tightened on the femur. Human remains, yeah, human, but the circumstances. User NC, it's strange. The lead archaeologist, they insisted we call you, said you're the best at figuring out what the bones are telling us, even when they're screaming. The lead archaeologist, that would be Dr. Albright. He was a man of grand pronouncements and even grander theories, but he had a grudging respect for my skills, I knew. He'd called me in once before for a puzzling case of ritualistic mutilation on a medieval skeleton. I'd spent days piecing together the narrative of violence, a narrative the official report had conveniently glossed over. Where is this Blackwood estate? I asked, already feeling a familiar, almost unwelcome prickle of anticipation. About 3 hours north of here, remote. There's a small town, Oakhaven, nearby. We've secured the site. The authorities are involved, but they're not sure what they're looking at. They're waiting on you. The femur slipped from my grasp, clattering softly against the polished wooden desk. My heart, usually a steady, quiet rhythm, gave an unexpected lurch. A fresh human skeleton, unearthed at an archaeological dig under suspicious circumstances. It was a scenario that usually belonged to the sensationalized headlines of tabloids, not my quiet, academic world. Yet the urgency in the voice on the other end of the line, the mention of Dr. Albright, the sheer incongruity of it all, pulled at something deep within me. I'll need to know the details of the discovery, I said, my voice gaining a sharper edge. When it was found, by whom, the exact location within the dig site, any associated artifacts, the condition of the remains. My mind was already racing, cataloging the questions, the necessary steps. We'll brief you when you get here, the gruff voice said. Just get here as fast as you can. We've got evidence about to be released, racing against time, and we don't want to contaminate anything or jump to the wrong conclusions. Evidence about to be released, racing against time. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. This wasn't just about a skeleton anymore. This was about a story that was unfolding, a story that demanded to be read before it was too late, before the truth was buried under layers of speculation or, worse, deliberate misdirection. I stood up, the worn wooden chair scraping against the floor. The femur lay on my desk, a silent, inert object. But the call had awakened something else, something more immediate, more urgent. The dust motes still danced in the sunlight, but now they seemed to swirl with a new, unsettling energy. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, a knot of apprehension mixed with an undeniable, almost addictive curiosity. My sanctuary was about to be invaded, not by a ghost from the past, but by a very present and very disturbing mystery. I grabbed my worn leather satchel, the one that held my most essential tools, my magnifying glass, my measuring tape, my small collection of brushes. The quiet hum of my office was about to be replaced by the roar of the unknown. The air inside the evidence about to be released, racing against time facility was sterile, a stark contrast to the damp, earthy smell I'd been breathing in for the past few days. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sterile glow on the rows of meticulously organized boxes. My fingers traced the edge of a clear plastic bag, a fragment of bone nestled inside. It was small, almost insignificant, yet it held the weight of a life. The words of the anonymous caller echoed in my mind, evidence about to be released, racing against time. It felt like a riddle, a desperate plea wrapped in an enigma. My colleague, a seasoned technician with perpetually ink-stained fingers, pointed to a larger container. "This is the bulk of it, user NC, recovered from the primary excavation zone." I nodded, my gaze fixed on the contents. Not just bones, but fragments of pottery, rusted metal objects, and what looked like desiccated organic material. A snapshot of a forgotten moment, now disturbed. The tension in the room was palpable, a silent acknowledgement that this discovery was more than just an archaeological find. "And the skeletal remains?" I asked, my voice a little rougher than I intended. The technician gestured to a separate, climate-controlled unit. "That's where things get complicated." Complicated, that was an understatement. The drive to the remote dig site was long and arduous. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to a rutted dirt track that tested the suspension of my battered SUV. Finally, we emerged into a wide, windswept valley. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of rain. In the distance, a cluster of tents and portable buildings huddled against the elements, a temporary island in a sea of rugged wilderness. This was it, the archaeological dig site. As I pulled up, a figure detached itself from the main camp and approached my vehicle. He was a burly man, his face etched with sun and wind, wearing a canvas jacket that had seen better days. A worn leather hat shaded his eyes, but I could feel his scrutiny. "User NC," he rumbled, his voice deep and gravelly. "I'm the site supervisor, welcome." I offered a tight smile, stepping out of the car. The wind whipped my hair around my face, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. "Thank you for having me." He gestured towards the cluster of tents. "We've got you set up in the main research tent. Not basic amenities, but it's dry." He paused, his gaze flicking towards a section of the valley floor where the earth had been disturbed. "The discovery, it's over there. We've cordoned off the area as instructed." As we walked, he filled me in on the details. "Found it a few days ago. Just an accidental find, really. One of the team was digging a test pit, deeper than usual, and hit something hard. Thought it was a rock at first, but then, well, you'll see." The excavation pit was a raw wound in the landscape, carefully marked with orange flagging tape. The air around it felt heavy, charged with an unspoken unease. Even from a distance, I could see the stark white of bone peeking through the soil. It was more than just a scattered collection of fragments. It was a remarkably intact skeleton, laid out as if in repose. But there was something about the positioning, the stillness of it all, that felt wrong. Another figure emerged from a nearby tent, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a determined set to her jaw. He wore practical field gear, his hands smudged with dirt. "User NC," he said, his voice crisp and efficient. "I'm the lead archaeologist. I've been waiting for you." I nodded, my attention already drawn to the skeleton. "It's more complete than I expected." The archaeologist's lips thinned. That's part of the problem and the location. It's not a burial site, not one we recognize anyway, and the depth. She trailed off, glancing at the supervisor. The supervisor cleared his throat. We've followed all the protocols, secured the area. No one's touched it since we found it, except, of course, for the initial recovery of what appeared to be a small, tarnished metal object clutched in its hand. My breath hitched. A metal object. Yes, the archaeologist confirmed, her gaze sharp. We've bagged it, of course. It's with the other preliminary findings, but it looked out of place, ancient but not quite right for the context. I knelt at the edge of the pit, my eyes scanning the remains. The long bones were clearly visible, the skull nestled amongst them. The way the rib cage was preserved, the delicate curve of the clavicle, it spoke of a sudden stillness, a life abruptly halted. But it was the angle of the skull, the subtle tilt, that snagged my attention. It wasn't resting naturally. It was positioned. A shiver traced its way down my spine, a sensation that had nothing to do with the encroaching rain. This wasn't just an old mystery unearthed. This felt like a story that was still being written, and the prologue, it seemed, was already chillingly familiar. The words from the anonymous caller, evidence about to be released, racing against time, pulsed in my mind. No longer just a cryptic message, but a palpable threat. The air in the temporary lab, a repurposed shipping container smelling faintly of canvas and damp earth, felt heavy. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful sound that echoed the unease settling in my gut. I'd managed to get the remains transferred here from the dig site, a chaotic jumble of tents and shouting archaeologists. Now, under the harsh glare of portable work lights, the skeleton lay spread out on a clean sheet of plastic. This was where the real work began. My gloved fingers traced the smooth, cool surface of a femur. Each bone was a story, a whisper from the past. I'd spent years learning to decipher those whispers, to piece together lives from fragments, but this felt different. The dig director, a man whose tweed jacket seemed permanently dusted with ancient soil, had been insistent. "Suspicious circumstances," he'd muttered, his eyes darting around as if the very dirt held secrets it shouldn't share. I started with the skull. The cranial vault was intact, no obvious fractures, but as I gently turned it, my gaze fell on the orbital sockets. There was something off, a slight asymmetry, a subtle indentation on the left side. I brought my magnifying glass closer. It wasn't a fracture from impact, not like a blow from a weapon. This looked more like a pressure mark, something that had pressed in over time. Odd. Next, the mandible. The teeth were remarkably well preserved, a testament to a life lived perhaps without excessive sugar. I counted them, noted the wear patterns, all present. No obvious signs of trauma here either. I moved on to the vertebral column, each vertebra a small, intricate puzzle piece. The thoracic vertebrae showed some minor arthritic changes, to be expected for someone likely in their late 20s or early 30s. But then I reached the lumbar region, and there it was, a distinct, almost perfectly circular depression on the anterior surface of the third lumbar vertebra. It was small, no bigger than a pencil eraser, but unmistakable. My breath hitched. I'd seen this before in a very different context. I pushed it down. Focus. This was about the past, not the present. I continued my examination, meticulously documenting every detail. The long bones of the limbs were long and slender, suggesting a person of average height. No signs of significant malnutrition or childhood illness that would leave indelible marks on the bone. The pelvis, crucial for sex determination, was broad, indicative of a female. So, a woman, likely in her late 20s or early 30s. The cause of death, however, remained elusive. No obvious trauma, no signs of disease that would have led to a swift demise. I carefully laid out the clavicles, the scapulae, the humeri. Everything seemed normal for a skeleton, but those two marks, the subtle indentation on the skull and the circular depression on the vertebra, gnawed at me. They weren't the kind of injuries I'd expect from a fall or an accident. They spoke of something deliberate, something precise. I looked up, my mind still wrestling with the implications of my findings. I've identified the individual as female, likely late 20s to early 30s. Cause of death isn't immediately obvious from blunt force trauma or sharp force trauma. There are some anomalies. I hesitated, debating how much to reveal. There are two distinct marks, one on the skull, one on a lumbar vertebra, that suggests something other than a natural death. He stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the bones. Anomalies? What kind of anomalies? I pointed to the skull. This indentation here, it's not a fracture. It looks like sustained pressure from a small, rounded object. I then indicated the vertebra, and this, a perfectly circular impression. Again, not a break, but a compression. He frowned, stroking his chin. Pressure from what? That's what I need to figure out, I answered, my voice tight. The pieces were starting to form a picture, a disturbing one. The careful preservation of the body, the lack of obvious violence, and these peculiar marks. It suggested a death that was meant to look natural or at least unexplainable. A carefully orchestrated end. My thoughts drifted to the current case. The one that had brought me here, the one that had been all over the news. A young woman found dead in her apartment, no forced entry, no signs of struggle. The initial report had been inconclusive, hinting at a possible accidental overdose. But something about the positioning of her body, the subtle bruising on her neck that the medical examiner had dismissed as post-mortem lividity, had felt wrong. Could this skeleton, buried for centuries, be connected to that? The thought was absurd, yet the parallels were too striking to ignore. The precision of the marks, the lack of overt violence, the potential for a staged scene. It was too much of a coincidence. I felt a prickle of unease, a familiar sensation that had nothing to do with the bones on the table. This wasn't just an archaeological puzzle anymore. It was becoming something more. Something that was forcing me to look at things I tried to bury deep within myself. The evidence about to be released, racing against time. It wasn't just about this skeleton. It was about the present too. And I had a terrifying feeling that the past and the present were about to collide in a way I wasn't prepared for. I needed more information, and fast. The air in the makeshift lab felt thick, heavy with the scent of dust and stale coffee. Outside, the wind howled a mournful tune around the remote dig site, a constant reminder of how isolated we were. I stared at the digital scan of the skeleton, the faint shadows on the femurs playing tricks on my eyes. The last words I'd spoken to the lead investigator echoed in my head. Careful preservation of the body, the lack of obvious violence, and these peculiar marks. It suggested a death that was meant to look natural or at least unexplainable. I needed context, not just about this skeleton, but about the people who'd lived and died on this land centuries ago. What kind of society buried someone like this? What were their beliefs, their fears, their methods? My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up digitized archives from the Regional Historical Society. I'd spent enough years in dusty university libraries to know how to navigate these digital labyrinths. I started with broad strokes: settlement patterns, agricultural practices, local folklore. The initial reports from the archaeological team were sparse, focusing on the superficial, the general period of the burial, the lack of associated artifacts beyond a few corroded metal fragments that were too degraded to identify. Then, I narrowed my search. I looked for records of conflict, of disease, of unusual burial practices in this specific geographic region. The land itself had a history, a layered past that wasn't immediately obvious from the surface. I found mentions of a small, self-sufficient community that had thrived here in the late 17th century, an isolated pocket that had largely escaped the notice of larger colonial powers. They were known for their strong adherence to tradition, their insular nature. A particular passage caught my eye. It spoke of a severe plague that had swept through the region in the early 1680. The records were vague, but they hinted at a devastating mortality rate and a desperate attempt by the survivors to contain the spread. It mentioned sanitary rites and segregation of the afflicted. The language was archaic, steeped in fear and superstition, but the implications sent a shiver down my spine. Could this skeleton be a victim of that plague? I zoomed in on the image of the femur again. The marks, while subtle, were consistent. Not fractures from trauma, not the kind of damage I'd see from a fall or a struggle. They were more like abrasions, delicate, almost surgical. I started cross-referencing the plague records with local church registries, or what passed for them in this remote area. Most of the early records were lost to time and decay, but I found fragments: births, deaths, marriages. The numbers were stark. Entire families wiped out in a matter of weeks. And then an anomaly. A period where the death records suddenly ceased, followed by a gradual, almost hesitant resumption. It was as if the community had gone silent, then slowly, painstakingly, rebuilt itself. The isolation of this community was also a significant factor. They were far from any major settlements, making them vulnerable and self-reliant. If a disease struck, they would have been on their own. No outside help, no access to advanced medical knowledge. Their methods of dealing with illness or death would have been dictated by their own beliefs and limited resources. I pulled up another set of documents, this time focusing on the societal structure. The community was heavily patriarchal, with a council of elders holding significant sway. Disputes were often settled internally, with harsh penalties for those who transgressed. There was a strong emphasis on communal harmony, on maintaining the delicate balance of their isolated existence. Anything that threatened that balance, be it disease or dissent, would have been dealt with decisively. My gaze drifted to the corner of the screen, where a small, blurred photograph was displayed. It was an old, faded image, part of a collection of historical documents I'd requested. It showed a group of people standing in front of a rough-hewn wooden building, their faces serious, their clothing plain. It was labeled simply, "The Council of Elders, circa 1690. I felt a prickle of unease. The faces were weathered, their eyes held a certain hardness that I found unsettling. One face in particular seemed to stand out. A man with a stern, unyielding expression, his gaze seemingly fixed on something beyond the camera. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen that look before in a different context, a different time. The pieces were still scattered, but they were starting to align in a disturbing pattern. A vulnerable community, a devastating plague, and a rigid social structure that prioritized order above all else. The marks on the skeleton, the careful preservation, it all pointed towards something deliberate, something orchestrated. I leaned back, rubbing my temples. The weight of history pressed down on me. This wasn't just about finding out how this person died. It was about understanding why. And I had a growing suspicion that the answer was buried deep within the secrets of this isolated community, secrets they might have gone to great lengths to keep hidden, even across centuries. The thought of the evidence about to be released, racing against time, felt more pressing than ever. What if this historical puzzle held the key to understanding a present-day atrocity? The air in the makeshift lab crackled with a different kind of energy now, a nervous hum that had nothing to do with the humming fluorescent lights. It was the smell of stale coffee and something metallic, the scent of too many people crammed into too small a space, all waiting. Waiting for what? I wasn't entirely sure, but the tension was a physical thing, pressing in on me. I sat hunched over my workstation, the articulated bones of the skeleton spread out before me like a macabre puzzle. Each fracture, each wear pattern, told a story I was painstakingly piecing together. The careful scrape of my scalpel against a calcified edge, the soft click of my calipers measuring a cranial suture, these were the sounds of my world, the quiet, deliberate language of the past. But today, the silence felt fragile, easily broken. A colleague, a sharp-eyed woman with perpetually ink-stained fingers, bustled over, her movements jerky with suppressed anxiety. "Anything, user NC," he whispered, his voice tight. I shook my head, not looking up. Still too early. The decomposition patterns are unusual, and the placement of the trauma, it's not straightforward. I pointed to a cluster of hairline fractures on the mandible. "This looks like blunt force, but the angle is all wrong for a fall." She leaned closer, her breath warm on my neck. The local authorities are getting antsy. They want answers yesterday." She paused, then added, her voice dropping even lower, "especially after the other one." My hand stilled. "The other one? I haven't heard." She looked surprised, then her expression shifted, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. "Pity, maybe. There was a body found about 50 miles from here just a few weeks ago. Unsolved. The details. They're starting to sound a little too familiar, user NC." My gaze snapped up from the bones. The stern, unyielding face from the photograph flashed in my mind, the one that had unsettled me. "Familiar how?" I asked, my voice a little rougher than I intended. She hesitated, glancing towards the door as if expecting someone to overhear. "The victim was a young woman. He was found in a wooded area not far from a disused quarry. Similar state of decomposition given the time frame and the preliminary reports. They mentioned blunt force trauma to the head and something about the way the body was positioned." My stomach gave a lurch. Blunt force trauma, the quarry, the positioning, these weren't common occurrences, not in the precise way he was describing them. "What about the positioning?" I pressed, my fingers clenching around my scalpel. "They said it was arranged, almost like a ritual, and some of the bones showed signs of being deliberately manipulated post-mortem. Not for study, not like we do. Something." The stern face. "The photograph. Was it just a coincidence? A trick of the light, a figment of my overactive imagination? This is all very preliminary, user NC," the colleague continued, sensing my unease. "The police are being tight-lipped. They're worried about causing panic, I suppose, especially with this other case on their hands. They're calling it the evidence about to be released, racing against time situation." She winced. "That's what one of the uniforms muttered when I asked. Sounds dramatic, doesn't it?" "Dramatic. Yes, that was one word for it. Terrifying was another." The ancient skeleton in front of me, its story etched in calcium and collagen, suddenly felt less like a relic of the distant past and more like a harbinger. I looked back at the skeleton's skull, its empty sockets seeming to stare back at me, the ancient violence that had ended this life. It wasn't just a historical curiosity anymore. It was a pattern. A terrifying, cyclical pattern that had breached the centuries and landed squarely in the present day, just miles from where I stood. My mind raced, sifting through the fragments of information. The stern face in the photograph, the local authorities' growing impatience, the unsettling similarities to the recent murder. It all coalesced into a knot of suspicion in my gut. This wasn't just about uncovering an ancient truth anymore. It was about preventing a modern tragedy, and the clock was ticking, faster than I'd ever felt it before. The weight of it settled on my shoulders, heavy and suffocating. I had to find out what was connecting these two deaths, and I had to do it before the evidence about to be released. Racing against time became a grim reality for someone else. The air in the makeshift lab, a repurposed shipping container smelling faintly of dust and disinfectant, crackled with a different kind of energy now. It wasn't the quiet hum of scientific inquiry. It was the hum of suspicion, a low thrumming that vibrated through my very bones. The ancient skeleton, designated Specimen A, had just become more than just a scientific puzzle. It had become a focal point, a silent witness to something that had happened here long ago, and perhaps not so long ago at all. My hands, usually steady when handling delicate fragments of bone, felt a tremor as I carefully brushed away the last vestiges of sediment from Specimen A's pelvic girdle. The fracture pattern was still bothering me. Not a clean break from a fall or the kind of trauma I'd expect from a burial. This was violent, deliberate, and the way the bones were positioned, almost like they'd been disturbed after death, made my stomach churn. "Anything, user NC?" The voice of the site supervisor, a gruff man with permanently dirt-stained hands, startled me. He was leaning against the container door, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the skeleton. I didn't look up immediately. "It's complicated. The trauma to the pelvis is significant, and there are other anomalies I'm still processing." I chose my words carefully. I couldn't just blurt out that the ancient remains looked like they'd been murdered. Not yet. Not without more concrete evidence. He grunted, a sound that could mean anything from agreement to utter disbelief. Complicated, right? Look, the regional liaison is coming tomorrow. They want an update, and they're bringing the evidence about to be released, racing against time. My head snapped up. Evidence? What evidence? He gestured vaguely with his chin. Stuff found near where specimen A was unearthed. Some personal effects. They think it might tie things together. This whole dig is about to blow up, user NC. They need answers. My mind raced. Personal effects. What kind of personal effects could survive centuries buried in this soil, and why were they only now being brought to light? It felt convenient, too convenient. I turned back to specimen A, my focus sharpening. The modern murder case, the one that had brought me here in the first place, had also involved a burial, albeit a much more recent one. And there had been personal effects found there too. A locket, a worn leather journal. Things that seemed insignificant at first, but that I'd felt even then were crucial. The supervisor, seeing my intense focus, pushed off the door. I read the expert user NC, figure it out, but don't keep us in the dark longer than I have to. This place is already a powder keg. He left, the clang of the container door echoing in the suddenly quiet space. Powder keg. He wasn't wrong. The tension here was palpable, a thick fog that had settled over the dig site since the modern discovery. And now, with the ancient skeleton hinting at a similar grim fate, that fog was turning into a storm. I ran a gloved finger along the edge of a rib bone. The striations here, faint but distinct, were not consistent with decomposition or natural decay. They looked like tool marks, small, precise marks, like someone had been trying to dismember the body. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a historical curiosity anymore. This was a crime scene. And the fact that it was so similar to the modern murder, the one I was here to solve, sent a shiver down my spine. Was it a coincidence? Or was there a connection, a thread of violence stretching across centuries? I remembered the modern victim. The way they were found, hidden almost like a secret. And the perpetrator, whoever they were, had been careful. Meticulous, just like the marks on specimen A suggested. I stood up, my legs stiff. I needed to see the site where specimen A had been found, undisturbed, and I needed to see this new evidence, whatever it was. My professional curiosity was a powerful force, but beneath it, a cold dread was beginning to bloom. This wasn't just about understanding the past. It was about preventing the present from repeating it. I walked out of the lab, the midday sun blinding after the dim interior. The dig site was a hive of activity, archaeologists and assistants swarming over different areas, their hushed conversations carrying on the wind. I spotted the area where specimen A had been unearthed. It was roped off, a stark white line against the ochre earth. As I approached, I saw a small group of people gathered near the perimeter. The site supervisor was there, talking animatedly to a woman in a crisp suit, her expression severe. Beside her, a younger man, also in professional attire, held a sealed evidence bag. My heart gave a strange lurch. I edged closer, trying to get a better look without being obvious. The woman in the suit gestured towards the dig site, then towards the evidence bag. The younger man nodded, his face grim. "They are artifacts," the site supervisor said, his voice carrying clearly. "Found in the same stratum as specimen A and some other things. A dagger, a small, tarnished silver locket, and a piece of fabric, very old, they think, from the period." A dagger, fabric. My mind flashed back to the modern crime scene. The victim's locket, the one that had been so carefully placed. My gaze flickered between the evidence bag and the stern faces of the officials. The pieces were starting to align, but not in a way that brought clarity. Instead, they formed a disturbing mosaic, a pattern of violence that seemed to echo across time. The woman in the suit turned, her sharp eyes scanning the area. "They landed on me. I must be user NC," he stated, his tone polite but firm. "We've been expecting the regional liaison. I'm here to assess the situation." Her gaze swept over me, then back to the dig site. "This discovery, both the ancient remains and the recent incident, is highly sensitive. We need to contain this, understand it, and we need to do it quickly. The press will be here any day." He was right. This was more than just an archaeological find. It was a potential scandal, and the parallels between specimen and the modern murder were too stark to ignore. Who at this remote dig site had been present for both discoveries? Who had the knowledge, the motive, to connect the past with the present in such a brutal fashion? The answer, I suspected, was buried somewhere within the earth, and perhaps within the hearts of the people I worked alongside every day, and I had a terrible feeling that time was running out to unearth it. The air in the hastily assembled makeshift lab, a repurposed shipping container smelling faintly of salt and diesel, was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the humidity. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the unease settling in my gut. The evidence about to be released, racing against time, was a ticking clock I couldn't afford to ignore. My colleague, the lead investigator, paced the narrow space, his boots scuffing the grimy floor. "They're pushing for a statement by morning, user NC," he responded, his voice tight. "The press is already circling like sharks. They smell blood." I ignored him, my gaze fixed on the magnified image on my laptop screen. It was a microscopic view of a fiber pulled from the remains of specimen A. Not just any fiber, but a specific type of wool, dyed with a rare indigo pigment. I'd seen this before, not here, not on these ancient bones, but elsewhere. My fingers, usually steady when handling delicate bone fragments, trembled slightly as I zoomed in further. The texture, the way the light caught the dye, it was a perfect match. A chill, unrelated to the sea breeze seeping through the cracks in the container, snaked down my spine. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was a thread pulled taut, leading from centuries ago to right now. The investigator stopped pacing and leaned over my shoulder. "What is it? You've gone pale." I shook my head, not trusting my voice. I pushed away from the table, needing space, needing air that didn't feel so heavy. I walked to the open door of the container, the salt spray misting my face. The dig site was a chaos of tarps and equipment under the darkening sky. The skeleton, specimen A, lay back in the earth, its secrets slowly being unearthed. But now, my secrets were starting to surface too. I remembered the smell, that same faint, earthy scent mixed with something acrid like burnt sugar. It had clung to everything in the aftermath, the smell of the aftermath. I tried to scrub it from my clothes, from my skin, from my mind, but some things leave a permanent stain. User NC. The investigator's voice was closer now, laced with concern. I turned back, my eyes scanning the scattered notes and diagrams on the table. The fiber, the pigment, the smell, it clicked, a horrifying, undeniable certainty locking into place. The indigo dye. It was used in a particular weaving technique, one I'd only encountered in a very specific, very personal context. A context I'd buried deep, deep down. "This wool," I began, my voice raspy, "it's from a specific type of sheep raised in the northern highlands. And the dye, it's a traditional method passed down through generations." I looked at the investigator, my eyes wide with a sudden horror. "It was used to make blankets for children." He frowned, clearly not understanding the leap I was making. "Children? What are you talking about?" I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "There was a fire years ago, a small community up north. A tragic accident, they said." My voice cracked. "A fire that consumed everything and everyone." I could see it now, a flash of memory, smoke, the frantic shouts, the searing heat, the desperate, futile search, the smell. The investigator's expression shifted, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He knew I'd had a past, a life before this remote archaeological dig, but he didn't know the details. I hadn't shared them. I'd built walls, brick by careful brick, around the wreckage. "User NC," he added, his tone softer now, "are you saying?" "I don't know what I'm saying," I admitted, the words tumbling out, raw and unfiltered. "But that fiber, it's identical to the ones I remember from that place, from the blankets." My hands clenched into fists. The objective scientist was crumbling, replaced by the terrified child I thought I'd left behind. The modern murder. The victim was found with a fragment of similar fabric. I dismissed it then. A common material, I thought, but now, with specimen A. The pieces were falling into place, but they weren't forming a coherent picture. They were forming a nightmare. The ancient skeleton, the modern victim, the indigo fiber, they were all connected. I looked at the evidence bag again, the one containing the fiber from specimen A. It was no longer just a piece of ancient textile. The evidence about to be released, racing against time, wasn't just about solving a crime. It was about confronting a trauma that had shaped me, a trauma I had tried to outrun, only to find it waiting for me here. In the dust of centuries, I need to see the fabric from the modern case again. I replied, my voice firming with a renewed, albeit shaky, resolve. All of it. I need to compare them properly. The investigator nodded, his gaze steady on mine, a silent acknowledgement of the personal storm brewing within me. My objectivity was compromised, yes, but perhaps, just perhaps, this personal connection was the key I needed to unlock the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The wind outside picked up, rattling the metal walls of the container, a fitting soundtrack to the unraveling of my carefully constructed composure. The air in the makeshift lab, a repurposed shipping container humming with generators, felt thick enough to chew. Dust motes danced in the harsh glare of the overhead fluorescents, each one a tiny, glittering accusation. I stared at the array of objects spread across the sterile, stainless steel table, the fragments of pottery, the corroded metal tools, and the star of the show, the skeletal remains. But my eyes kept drifting to the smaller pile, the one that held the modern evidence. The indigo fiber, the faint, almost imperceptible scorch mark on the victim's rib, and the detailed map I'd painstakingly pieced together from the dig logs. It's all here, I murmured, my voice raspy from disuse. I'd spent the last 2 days holed up in here, immersed in the past and the present, the scent of damp earth and formaldehyde clinging to me like a second skin. The ancient skeleton, the one we'd unearthed from beneath the crumbling foundation of the old settlement, had yielded a surprising amount of information. Age, sex, cause of death, blunt force trauma, consistent with being struck by a heavy, irregular object. But it was the subtle details, the ones that only a forensic anthropologist with a particular, obsessive bent could spot, that were truly unsettling. The peculiar spacing of the teeth, the slight asymmetry in the left femur, details that whispered of a life and a death that mirrored the recent tragedy with an unnerving precision. Then there was the modern victim, the body found in the abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. Blunt force trauma, same peculiar spacing of the teeth, same slight asymmetry in the left femur. My gut, a notoriously unreliable organ, was screaming. It had been snagged on the victim's shirt, a vibrant splash of color against the drab fabric. I'd sent it off to the lab myself, a personal favor from a contact I'd cultivated over the years, a man who owed me for a debt I'd rather not revisit. He'd confirmed my suspicions. It wasn't just any indigo dye. It was a specific, almost archaic blend. The kind used by the artisans of this very region centuries ago, the kind that might have been used to dye the very clothes worn by the skeleton I was studying, and the map. The one I'd found tucked away in a hidden compartment of the dig supervisor's tent, a place I'd only discovered because I'd tripped over a loose floorboard during a particularly frustrating search. It wasn't a survey map. It was a diagram, a meticulous hand-drawn map of the excavation site, but with an added layer of detail. Hidden chambers, secret passages, and a small, meticulously marked X deep within the earth, far from any designated excavation zone. My gaze fell on the dig supervisor, who was hovering near the entrance of the container, his face a mask of polite concern. He'd been unusually solicitous since the discovery, always offering help, always asking if I needed anything, too solicitous. "You answered you found this map in my tent," he asked, his voice carefully neutral. I met his eyes, my own narrowed. "Yes, tucked away, almost as if someone didn't want it found." He gave a short, nervous laugh. "Must have fallen out of a logbook. We're always misplacing things out here." "This wasn't misplaced," I stated, my voice low and steady. "This was hidden, and it shows a location deep underground that isn't on any of the official survey maps. a location that aligns with where we found the ancient remains. His eyes flickered, a subtle shift that I caught. A professional observer learns to read the smallest tells. The slight widening of the pupils, the almost imperceptible clench of a jaw. "It's an old map," he responded, his voice a little too quick. "Probably some fanciful drawing by an early settler. They were prone to exaggeration." "This isn't exaggeration," I countered, pushing the map closer to him. "This is precision, and it matches the unique geological formations we encountered during the excavation. Formations that are not visible on the surface. Formations that point to a specific hidden cavity." I gestured to the skeleton. "This cavity where we found our subject and where, according to this map, there are other similar cavities." I paused, letting the implication hang in the air. The ancient skeleton, the modern victim, the map, and now the dig supervisor's evasiveness. It was all converging, a storm I'd seen brewing for days. "You've been here for years," I added, my voice hardening. "You know this land better than anyone, you know its secrets." He shifted his weight, his gaze dropping to the table. "I know the lay of the land, yes. And you know about the indigo dye," I pressed. "The kind that was used by the indigenous people of this area. The kind that was found on the modern victim. The kind that could have been used to dye the clothing of the ancient skeleton." He finally looked up, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than polite concern in his eyes. It was a glint of something cold, something sharp. "You're making a lot of leaps, user NC," he replied, his tone losing its forced pleasantness. "Am I?" I picked up a small, tarnished metal object from the table. It was a tool, its purpose unclear, but its shape was distinctive. This was found with the ancient remains, and something very similar, though cleaner, was found at the abandoned factory. I looked at him, my gaze unflinching. "Along with an indigo fiber, and the same type of blunt force trauma. Tell me, supervisor, how many people have died on this dig site or near it in the past few years? How many have been conveniently overlooked?" The air crackled with unspoken accusations. He took a step back, his hand going to his pocket. The evidence was about to be released, racing against time, and I was the one holding the detonator. The air crackled with unspoken accusations. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I had just stepped directly into the path of whatever darkness had been lurking beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful excavation. The evidence was about to be released, racing against time. My own heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a counterpoint to the quiet rustle of the wind through the dry scrub. I didn't wait for him to make a move. My gaze flickered from his tight-lipped expression to the heavy canvas bag clutched in his hand. Whatever was in there, it was the key. It had to be. I'd spent weeks meticulously reconstructing the life and death of the woman buried in the earth, and the pieces were finally clicking into place. The strange positioning of her limbs, the peculiar markings on her femurs, they weren't accidental. They spoke of a deliberate, brutal act. Back in my temporary workspace, a repurposed shipping container smelling faintly of dust and old canvas, I laid out the latest findings. The radiocarbon dating placed the skeleton firmly in the late 17th century, a period of intense religious fervor and paranoia in this region. The victim, a woman I'd started to think of as Ilara, based on a faded inscription on a small, tarnished locket found near her remains, had not died of natural causes. The fracture patterns on her skull were consistent with blunt force trauma, and the way her hands were positioned, almost as if trying to ward off a blow, sent a cold knot of dread through me. But it was the minuscule fragments I'd recovered from beneath her fingernails that truly unnerved me. Under the harsh glare of my microscope, they resolved into what looked like wood fibers. Not just any wood, either. These were dense, resinous, and bore the faint, unmistakable scent of pine. Pine trees weren't native to this immediate area, not in the 17th century and certainly not now. They grew in abundance in the higher elevations, miles to the north, where the old logging camps used to be. Why would Ilara have pine fibers under her nails? Had she been in the woods, or had her killer been? The implication was staggering. It meant the killer had traveled, perhaps from a distance, to commit this act, and why. The locket offered a clue, a tiny engraved symbol that I'd cross-referenced with historical texts. It was a mark associated with a small, dissenting religious sect that had been persecuted for their beliefs. Alara, it seemed, was a heretic. My fingers traced the faint outline of a scratch mark on the inside of her left tibia. It was shallow, almost superficial, but there was something about its trajectory, its depth, that felt wrong. It wasn't a defensive wound, not like the ones on her skull. This looked more like a deliberate etching, a message carved into bone. I zoomed in, adjusting the focus. The fibers I'd found under her nails seemed to have been snagged on something sharp, something that had also left this mark. Then it hit me. The wood, the scratch, the locket. I scrambled for my tablet, pulling up the archaeological survey maps. The old logging camps were marked, and not far from them, a cluster of caves. Caves that, according to local folklore, had been used as secret meeting places by those very dissenting groups. My breath hitched. What if Alara hadn't been killed near her village at all? What if she'd been taken or had gone willingly to one of these remote locations? He'd insisted it was a natural burial, an anomaly. It suggested it had been brought there, a deliberate attempt to obscure the true nature of the burial. The pieces coalesced, forming a picture of a clandestine journey, a desperate flight, and a brutal end. Alara, a member of a persecuted sect, had likely met her killer in the northern woods, perhaps during a secret gathering. The pine fibers were from her attacker, or the place where he was held before her death. The scratch on her tibia, it was too precise for a random injury. It was a signature, a mark left by the tool that had inflicted the fatal blow, a tool made of wood. A sharpened stake, perhaps. A wave of nausea washed over me. The image of a stake driven into flesh flashed behind my eyes, a visceral echo of a trauma I'd long tried to bury. My hands began to tremble. This wasn't just a historical case anymore. The parallels to the recent murder at the edge of town, the one that had brought me to this desolate place in the first place, were too stark to ignore. The same brutal, ritualistic elements. I looked at the skeleton again, at the silent testament of Alara's final moments. She hadn't just been murdered, she'd been erased. Her story, her life, her very existence had been deliberately buried. And now, centuries later, someone was repeating the performance. The evidence was about to be released, racing against time, and I was caught in the middle of a historical echo that was rapidly becoming a modern-day nightmare. I had to get to those caves. I had to find out what happened to Alara, and I had to do it before the past consumed the present entirely. I took a step back, my hand going to my pocket. My own pulse thrummed a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a stark contrast to the stillness of the bones I'd spent weeks piecing together. My fingers traced the faint discoloration on the tibia, a mark I'd initially dismissed as post-mortem damage. Now, under the harsh glare of the portable work lamp, it screamed intent. It wasn't the random gnawing of rodents or the slow decay of soil. This was deliberate, a sharp object, wielded with force. I'd seen similar trauma before, not on ancient remains, but in the sterile, chilling environment of a modern crime scene. I read awfully quiet, user NC. The lead investigator's voice, gravelly and laced with impatience, cut through my thoughts. He stood a few feet away, his silhouette framed by the open doorway of the makeshift lab, a repurposed shipping container crammed with equipment. Sunlight, a blinding white slash, poured in behind him, making the dust motes dance like tiny, frantic spirits. I didn't look up. My gaze was fixed on the screen of my laptop, where the high-resolution scans of the skeleton lay displayed. The digital reconstruction allowed me to manipulate the image, to zoom in on the minutiae that the naked eye, even with magnification, might miss. That's where I'd found it. The minute fracture pattern on the distal end of the radius, consistent with a forceful downward blow. Not a fall, not an accident. Just processing, I murmured. My voice a little hoarse, I cleared my throat. The skeleton. I think I've found something that changes things. The investigator took a step closer, his heavy boots crunching on the thin layer of grit that seemed to cover everything here. Changes what? We've got a body, user NC, an old one sure, but still a body. What else is there to find? I finally met his eyes. His face was etched with fatigue, the kind that goes beyond a few sleepless nights. It was a weariness that settled deep into the bones, the kind I recognized from my own time working the grim details of the past. This wasn't a natural death, I stated, my voice firm. Not then, and I suspect not now either. I pointed to the screen. Look here, the angle of the fracture, the specific type of splintering. It's a match for the kind of impact we see from a heavy, bladed object. Something like a spade, perhaps, or a broad-bladed knife. He squinted at the image, then at me. A spade. I read talking about a farmer's tool, user NC. And what's the primary tool of an archaeologist? A trowel, yes. But for larger excavations, for digging deeper, for dealing with stubborn soil, a spade is often used. My mind flashed back to the site manager's hands, perpetually stained with earth, his calloused palms. He'd been so eager to show me the excavation, so proud of his discoveries. He'd also been the one who'd found the skeleton, claiming it was just a lucky break, a bonus to the historical narrative. But who would do that? The investigator pressed. And why? This happened centuries ago. That's what I've been trying to figure out, I admitted. My gaze drifted to a small, tarnished silver locket I'd recovered from the burial site, nestled near the skeleton's clavicle. I'd cataloged it, photographed it, but hadn't yet subjected it to rigorous analysis. It was too small, too delicate for the heavy-handed approach I'd applied to the bones. This locket, I said, pulling up another image. It's an anomaly. The craftsmanship is far too fine for the period we're excavating, and there's an inscription very faint on the back. I zoomed in, enhancing the contrast. The letters were tiny, almost microscopic. A.M. to my dearest forever. The investigator leaned in, his breath warm on my neck. A.M. A.M. It was a set of initials I hadn't thought about in years, a ghost that had haunted my childhood. My mother's initials, Amelia Miller. My hands trembled. I pushed them into my pockets, clenching my fists. This couldn't be a coincidence. The violence I saw in the bones, the locket, the initials. It was too much. We assumed this was a burial from the colonial era, but what if it wasn't? What if this person died much more recently? I reran the radiocarbon dating calculations, plugging in new parameters, considering the possibility of more recent contamination or a different stratum entirely. The results flickered on the screen and my breath hitched. If the initial dating was off, if this skeleton was only a few decades old, then the violence made a terrifying kind of sense. The deliberate, forceful blow. The locket. The site manager, I said, my voice suddenly sharp, cutting through the investigator's contemplation. He's been here for years, hasn't he? Overseeing various digs, always with a keen eye for preservation. The investigator's head snapped up. He has. Why? Because, I said, my gaze locking onto the screen, the digital bones now appearing to writhe with a new, horrific significance. The evidence isn't just about a centuries-old murder. It's about a modern one, too. And I think I know who the killer is. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, the same force that had ended the life of the person buried beneath us. The past and the present had collided, and I was standing right at the epicenter. The air in the makeshift lab, a repurposed shipping container at the edge of the dig, felt thick with unspoken accusations. My fingers, usually steady as I brushed away centuries of soil, trembled slightly as I pointed at the monitor. The digital reconstruction of the skeleton, a ghost born from pixels and data, seemed to mock me. Because, I said, my voice raspy, a stark contrast to the sterile hum of the equipment, the evidence isn't just about a centuries-old murder, and I think I know who the killer is. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, the same sickening lurch I'd felt years ago, staring at the shattered remnants of my own past. A long silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant groan of the wind whipping across the barren landscape. The associate, whose face I'd only ever seen etched with professional detachment, now seemed to hold a flicker of something else, a wary curiosity, perhaps, or something more sinister. I couldn't quite place it. I think, the associate began, their tone measured, that this ancient case is connected to the recent events. Not just connected, I corrected, my gaze fixed on the screen. The subtle asymmetry in the mandible, the faint but distinct signs of a struggle on the distal humerus, it all coalesced. The modus operandi is too precise, too familiar. The way the bones were handled, the specific injuries. It's not just a coincidence, it's a signature. I scrolled through the images, highlighting the areas that had nagged at me for days. The clean break in the tibia, far too precise for a simple fall. The unusual pattern of fractures on the skull, suggesting blunt force trauma delivered with a specific, almost surgical intent. These weren't the random acts of a desperate attacker, this was calculated. Look at this, I said, zooming in on a series of small indentations near the clavicle. These marks, they're consistent with a tool, not a weapon, not in the traditional sense, something used for detail work, something that requires immense control. I swallowed, the dryness in my throat intensifying, like a specialized chisel. The associate leaned closer, their breath misting the edge of the monitor. For a moment, I saw only the shared fascination with the minutiae of death, the quiet obsession that had drawn us both to this desolate place. Then their eyes flickered to mine, and I saw it, the subtle shift, the almost imperceptible hardening of their gaze. I've been spending too much time with the dead, user NC, the associate said, their voice dropping a notch, losing its professional veneer. It was flatter now, colder. I rest seeing patterns where there are none. My stomach twisted, this was it. The moment the carefully constructed facade began to crumble, I remembered the hushed conversations, the offhand remarks I dismissed as dig site gossip, the associate's unusual interest in the precise dating of the skeleton, their insistence on accessing the preliminary findings before they were officially processed. No, I stated, my voice gaining a hard edge. I'm seeing patterns that have been deliberately obscured. The report on the recent incident, it mentioned a peculiar item found near the victim, something described as a craftsman's tool. I met the associate's gaze, my own hardening. A chisel, wasn't it? A very specific kind. The associate didn't flinch. Instead, a slow, almost imperceptible smile spread across their lips, a chilling parody of reassurance. Fascinating, isn't it? How the past can echo the present. My mind raced, a frantic scramble for evidence, for proof. The associates' access to the dig site, their knowledge of the skeletal remains, their quiet demeanor that had always masked a sharp, observant mind. It all clicked into place with terrifying clarity. The associate, the one person I'd allowed myself to trust in this isolated corner of the world, was the perpetrator. I found this skeleton, and I saw the opportunity to test my methods, to perfect my craft. The associate took a step back, their smile widening. It was no longer a pretense of normalcy. It was pure, unadulterated triumph. I always were too clever for my own good, user NC, a shame, really. Suddenly, the wind outside seemed to howl louder, a mournful prelude to the storm that was brewing within the confines of the shipping container. The evidence, the very bones I'd spent weeks meticulously excavating, were about to be released, racing against time, and I was trapped with the very person who had manipulated them. The tension in the air was a physical weight, pressing down on me, forcing me to fight for every breath. I had to get out. I had to ensure justice for the ancient dead and for the one whose life had been so brutally extinguished. But first, I had to survive this moment. The metallic shriek of the shipping container door being forced open ripped through the tense silence. My breath hitched, a knot tightening in my gut. I braced myself, my gaze fixed on the widening gap, ready for, I didn't know what. The air, thick with the smell of damp concrete and something vaguely metallic, felt suffocating. Outside, the storm had truly broken, a relentless drumming on the corrugated roof that mirrored the frantic rhythm of my own pulse. The figure silhouetted against the bruised twilight was the lead investigator. He stepped inside, dripping, his expression grim. Behind him, a uniformed officer followed, his eyes scanning the cramped space, lingering on the scattered tools and the overturned stool. User NC, the lead investigator said, his voice a low rumble that barely cut through the wind. The lab results are back, They confirmed it. The DNA from the modern remains matches the familial markers we pulled from the historical samples. It's him, the perpetrator. My shoulders sagged, a wave of exhaustion washing over me. It was him. After all this time, all the dead ends, all the whispers from the past echoing in the present, it was finally confirmed. The link was undeniable. The centuries-old crime, the brutal act that had haunted this land, had found its echo in a recent, equally violent death. And the evidence? I managed, my voice raspy. I gestured vaguely towards the crates stacked precariously. The evidence about to be released, racing against time. The lead investigator nodded, a muscle twitching in his jaw. We intercepted it, just barely. The courier was apprehended a few miles down the road. He was carrying the final pieces of the puzzle, the digitized records, the scanned documents from the archive, all encrypted. So they knew we were close. They knew we were getting too close, he corrected. This whole operation, the staged discovery, the attempts to discredit my findings, it was all to bury the truth for good this time. He looked at the skeleton laid out on the examination table, a silent testament to the suffering of two eras. My work, user NC, it didn't just solve a historical puzzle, it exposed a modern-day monster hiding in plain sight. I ran a hand over my face, the rough stubble a familiar sensation. The weight of it all, the sheer magnitude of the interconnectedness, was almost too much to bear. I thought of the woman in the woods, her life brutally extinguished, and the nameless soul who had met a similar fate so long ago. Their stories, once separated by an unbridgeable chasm of time, were now irrevocably entwined, their voices finally heard through the language of bone. The historical context, I murmured, my gaze drifting to the small, tarnished locket I'd recovered from the older burial site. It had been so insignificant then, a mere trinket. But now, knowing the truth, it felt like a direct message. The locket was his daughter's, the one he was trying to protect, the one he believed was taken. The lead investigator's eyes softened. And the modern perpetrator, he was a descendant of the very family who benefited from the original crime. He discovered the truth, perhaps through those very records he tried to steal, and instead of seeking justice, he chose to repeat the cycle. Inside, a different kind of storm was subsiding. The pieces, jagged and sharp, were finally fitting together, forming a complete, albeit tragic picture. I felt a strange calm settle over me, a quiet acceptance. I had always been drawn to the stories the dead could tell, but this case had demanded more. It had demanded that I confront the echoes of my own past, the trauma I had tried to bury beneath layers of academic rigor and scientific detachment. The locket, now resting in a sealed evidence bag, seemed to pulse with a faint warmth. And the modern crime, a mirror of that ancient cruelty, was a stark reminder of how easily the past could infect the present. "He's been apprehended?" I asked, needing the finality. "He's in custody," the lead investigator confirmed. "And the evidence about to be released, racing against time, is now secure. My work here is done, user NC. I've brought them both justice." Justice. The word felt heavy, earned. I looked at my hands, the hands that had sifted through dirt and bone, that had pieced together fragments of lives long gone. They were stained with the dust of centuries, but they were also clean. The wind howled, but for the first time it sounded less like a lament and more like a promise of a new dawn.